Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining. This is Questioning the Sanctity of Brand Archetypes, Reimagining the Planner's Toolkit for a Changing World. I'm Chris Konya. I'm a managing director and principal at SYLVAIN Labs. We think of ourselves as agents of progress. We work in the worlds of strategy and design consulting, mostly in the areas of product innovation and brand design. And we think of ourselves as aiming to create progress for both business and culture. Today, I want to talk about the Planner's Toolkit and one tool in particular, brand archetypes. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk about stories. I don't need to tell a bunch of planners how important stories are. Stories are at the core of the work that we do. We tell stories every day. We tell stories to our clients. We tell stories to consumers. We tell stories to ourselves. And we are very aware of the narratives that we write. But it's not just for us as planners. The reason that we do this is because stories are so important and innate. They're such a core part of human existence. Stories actually were a large part of how we evolved early on. They set us apart from the Neanderthals, our ability to imagine things that didn't exist already. We passed knowledge down through the generations through stories. And the storytellers of these societies, of these villages, were called griots, and they were lauded. They were important people within those societies. And today, stories link us all together. They create the meaningful grounds for human connection. They are how we relate to one another. They build our empathy and put our brains in sync. Stories are what shape our society and influence the minds of our generations. And all great stories are fueled by great characters. Jay Gatsby, the White Whale, Atticus Finch, Ebenezer Scrooge. These great characters are those that are etched in the minds of our society. They are the people that we meet on a regular basis who inspire us. And we meet these characters everywhere, every day. Sometimes when we're chilling, watching Netflix, and sometimes when we're reading magazines and the news. Some of our most inspiring characters of our time are those icons who show us how to live in the world today. Ava DuVernay, Naomi Osaka, Chadwick Boseman. These are the people the characters, who create our ideas of who we are. They help us to relate to ourselves and to one another. They teach us how to be. They define our dreams. They inspire who we can become. And if we're lucky, they will also be the stories and the characters that we create as strategists. Defining the identities, the personalities, the tone of voice, the mission and principles and purpose behind these great brand characters, giving them clarity and definition, helping them to become empathetic characters that people can relate to. This is our work. This is the core of what we do. Walt Disney is a brand that it's just so strong. It's one that everyone feels the character of the Magic Kingdom right away. We all know it inherently in ourselves. MTV is another example of a great brand character that has been created, one that has such specific point of view as almost as an individual. This is a brand that related so well and resonated so well that it defined an entire generation. The Marlboro brand is probably one of the most iconic and certainly it's tested as the most recognized brands in the world. Funny thing about Marlboro brand is that it used to be a brand for women. So back in the 20s, when it was first born, the advertisings for Marlboro featured Gibson girls and flappers. Their slogan was "Mild as May." And in 1955, that was when they birthed the Marlboro Man, and the sales went through the roof. They raised 3,000% within 1 year, and the Marlboro Man essentially defined masculinity in America. While that idea of masculinity has changed, the amazing power of a brand character, is what you see in Marlboro. The truth of these brands, though, and these characters that we've created is that they weren't just born in the back office of some advertising agency. Like all great ideas are derivative of an idea before them, and all the great characters of our time are derivative of our past. They root in a set of archetypes. These archetypes are representative of the characters that make us up all human beings. And since we are strategists, I'd love to spend a little bit of time nerding out on archetypes, if you will, if you'll let me. When we look back at the term archetype and we think about what does this word actually mean? Where does it come from? What is its origins? We realize that actually the word archetype comes from Greek, ancient Greek, meaning the original pattern or the first form. That first form comes from its original origin, which is from Plato. Well, actually it was from Socrates, but Plato was the one who kind of wrote it down. The idea of forms, theory of forms, was this idea that Plato had that beyond the physical world that we live in, there is a world of forms. And that world is what defines each of the things that we touch and know and can feel in the physical world. So for example, appleness is something that exists. When you look at a different apple, this one might be a little bit oval, or this one might be a little bit, misshapen or colored or decaying, but there is an ideal form. There is the round, ripe apple that everybody, all of us, understand. And that idea of the ideal form is that theory that Plato had. Then Jung took that theory and applied it to people. Jung is often credited with having originated the archetypes. Of course, his work was derivative, but he was the one who first applied them to people. And he said that archetypes are a universal language, that they are innate in every human. When we are born, we are connected through this collective unconscious that link us together through these common ideas. And so when Jung first developed the archetypes, there were 4 that he believed in at first: the persona, the shadow, the animus, and the self. And then from there, he built on them, right? He evolved them. So from there, he built out the mother, the father, the child, the sage, the hero, and eventually he came to the 12 archetypes. And this is probably an archetype wheel that is more recognizable, one that hopefully you've seen in some form before as a strategist and a planner. These archetypes were not the end-all be-all, though. When you start to look at archetypes, you realize that actually several sets of archetypes have been born over time. Carolyn Myss created the 80 archetype cards. Within the hero's journey, there is its own set of archetypes. The Enneagrams have their own set of archetypes, as well as the Greek gods often are, they're kind of referred to as the original archetypes. And so when we look at the brand archetypes that we have created or that we use today, we realize that there's a strong history behind them. And whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, we rely on these archetypes all the time as we build and shape our brands. These archetypes, they're shortcuts. They help us build brands with clarity and with cohesiveness. They're a cornerstone in the Strategist Toolbook. And especially now in a time where we're being asked to plan in real time, they are so important to the way that we work. And yet, as we look at the history of archetypes, I can't help but wonder, they have evolved so much and so many times. There have been so many different angles and incarnations and evolutions on these archetypes. Why have our brand archetypes never evolved? How have we never questioned or reimagined them? Isn't that our jobs as strategists? Isn't that what we do every day with pretty much everything, as we build watertight arguments, questioning everything? How have we never questioned our archetypes? For that matter, how have we never questioned Tuckman's journey, or the 4Ps, or the 3Cs, or the golden circles? All of these frameworks and these tools that we hold so dear and we treat so sacredly. Are they the end-all be-all? Were they an evolution for something before? Can they be evolved today? As we question the fundamentals of our brands, shouldn't we also be questioning the fundamentals of how we work? Now I get it, today we're being asked to plan in real time. We are being asked to plan faster than ever before, to stretch into wholly uncharted territories, to answer questions that we have never had to answer before. And we're being asked to do it in real time. But is planning in real time really just about moving quickly? Is it not also about thinking deeply in addition to moving fast? Are there pitfalls in only thinking quickly? Today, we're being asked to carry our brands through unprecedented environments, to think through and make statements on issues that we have never had the ability to impact in our society before. Today, we're being asked to see our brands through new cultural lenses, to set fundamental behaviors and perspectives for these brands that never before have been focused on, and never before have we had this kind of power and influence in the world. You know, maybe not single-handedly, but we're being asked into a conversation to upend racism, to challenge systemic and intersectional issues that, you know, started before we were born. Think through the power of our brands in the light of these new values and issues in this moment, and think through them through the lens of our work. Think about frameworks. Frameworks are these hard and fast, straight-edged things that have been set in stone and encased for so long. But the world that we live in, the world that we plan in, this world is not rigid. It is not like a framework. We don't live in frameworks. Humans are fluid. We are ephemeral. Our thinking is ephemeral. We are ephemeral too. The great words of Alan Watts, we wiggle. So maybe the way that we think and the way that we plan should also wiggle. So if we were to apply this thinking back to the archetypes and think more fundamentally about the work that we do and how we do it and how to wiggle, the first thing might be to think about these archetypes and think about their fundamentals through the lens of today. The truth about archetypes is that we love them and we hate them. We love them because they're familiar. They create comfort and understanding. They represent patterns that we know. But also we hate them because they're familiar, because they're repetitive, because they're expected, because they become tropes, because they don't represent the complexity and the realness of us as people. In fact, when you look at the great characters of today, the icons and the inspirations of our time, they don't fit into these archetypes. In fact, they're actively fighting against traditional notions of who these archetypes are. They are redefining our notions of who a leader can be. They are asking, what does a pop star look like? They are rethinking who plays the leading man. And they are redefining who a politician must be. And as we start to look at these icons and these characters who are part of our lives, and we start to look at the stories that shift and that we are creating in order to shift how we think, that humans are creating. The Joker is just such an amazing character, and you know, this villain archetype, this kind of single note maniacal villain of the past. That villain doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the performance of today's Joker is like, it's so tremendous. If you think about it, it's this sort of this mental health stricken victim of society who's really just looking for his place in the world. You really question how much he understands and what he knows and what he sees of the world. You relate to him, you understand him. And you know, Jung said that all of these archetypes are within all of us. That complexity and that depth, you know, that's the real truth of these characters and these icons and of us as people. That's why they're relatable. This is another archetype of a character that's changed, right? That, you know, the teenage struggle, the happy, shiny, romanticized idea of what it is to be a teenager. You know, you look at Serena van der Woodsen, and she was so often saved by men in her, you know, around her. She lived in this kind of like world that she explored through the dalliance of, you know, teenage behaviors. And you look at that through the lens now of Rue Bennett. And we realize like the trauma, the grittiness, the raw and unbearable life, you know, the struggle that she carries, the depth of character and the, you know, the meaningfulness in her character is so much stronger than ever before. I can't help but also then look at the finance guy, right? This is like a character that we have known for ages. The Wolf of Wall Street was not the first. And he, you know, didn't start off as this power hungry guy, but he became corrupt and selfish. And, you know, it was all of his aims were toward these selfish pleasures versus, you know, we see now Taylor, who is attempting to navigate around power plays, around sexism, you know, fighting for values-based investing, managing their own desires, you know, for power as well as for values and for the good of society. The depth of that character and the way that these characters are evolving is tremendous. And it makes us question, it makes us have to stop and think, you know, if the great characters of today are more complex and more meaningful than the individual archetypes that we had started with, that we still use as our wheel, you know, as the creators of these brand characters, you have to ask yourself, do we take the shortcut to familiarity, or are we willing to break the mold and create more complex characters that reflect a new era, the kinds of characters that people are craving today, that people are sophisticated enough to understand beyond the characters that we had before? When we look back at the brand archetype wheel, we start to realize it looks a little dated. The characters, the archetypes themselves are potentially a bit single note, maybe not quite as relevant as they could be. And you start to think about, how could these archetypes wiggle? Could you put a new lens on them? Could you combine them to become more, to have more depth? Could you reinvent and evolve them? Which is what we did. We realized that this was not the only way that this tool could live. We thought to ourselves, let's challenge it. Let's challenge ourselves, help ourselves see brands in a new light and think of them in a more modern way. I'm not saying that this wheel is the end all be all, and I'm not saying that we would abandon the old brand archetypes. I think those are ageless and that they will come back. But I am saying that recreating the wheel helped us to think more deeply about planning in real time and how we do it. It also helped us to think more deeply about the brands that we create and what they mean in society today. Let me take a minute and just break these down. So there were three things that we did when we looked at these archetypes. First, we leaned on the depth of character within them. So when you look at these archetypes, you realize that each one of them actually has a depth of character that is deeper than the original archetypes. And a great, human character that represents this is LeBron James. I mean, superstar athlete, philanthropist, he owns his own school, production company. There are so many different angles and understandings of who this person is. And when we start to think about brands, we realize that these brands that we had once aspired to be like, maybe need to be more than just aspirational. Now they need to be a best friend. They need to be an advisor. They need to be an inspiration. They need to give us ideas. I think Glossier is a fantastic brand that embodies all of the depth of character and these different angles that we might not have gone for in times past. The second thing that we did was we pushed for progress. Anyone who has the power of influence today is being asked to push for progress. It is almost a requirement of having the influence that we do. You have to think about how you use that influence. And progress is something that is lauded in many of these brands. It's something that we should be proud to be able to do, is to push for progress. Yara Sahidi is one who just does this so naturally. And of course, Patagonia is sort of the classic brand that pushes for progress. Enough said. The last thing that we did was we thought through the lens of humility. Last year, I ran a workshop at Stratfest around the humble brand. And that idea came from this sense that aspirational brands are no longer what the consumer needs. Consumers define their own aspirations. They don't ask for brands to define who they need to be. In fact, brands who try to define who consumers should be, they stand in the face of pitfall. Instead, what consumers are asking for from brands is to help them to get to where they want to be. That requires a level of humility that brands hadn't seen or understood before. Humility and context and understanding what our role is amongst our consumers and the context that we live within. And I think Waze is a brand that does this so well. Come on. Waze is a brand that realizes that the power of its brand is in its community, and the power of what it does and it accomplishes is actually through the community that builds it. Waze could have gone a totally different way with the way that they think of themselves, but actually centering and focusing on that community has been its success. And so we look back at this wheel, this updated wheel, and we realize that it's been updated through the cultural lens of today. When you look at the individual archetypes here, the magician has turned to the catalyst, the hero to the mobilizer, the lover to the self-advocate. The depth, the progress, the humility within all of this is really kind of what changed and grew these archetypes. But more than anything, I think the wheel represents a questioning. It represents a questioning of tools, of things that we think are hard and fast, especially in a time where so much is up in the air. I think this wheel can be something that we can get wiggly with. And so I ask you today to spend some time beyond thinking fast, think deep. Think about how you will impact the world around you. Re-examine your arsenal. Look at the tools that you use and look at them through a new lens. And last, build for modern relevance. Think about how you use these tools in the modern day and the values of today. How can they help you to do what you aim to do in society? Finally, I'll leave you with one last statement to question your approach. This is a big moment for us. Put a focus on how you approach your work. Be bold. Take fresh eyes to it. Rework it, break it, remake it. Don't be shy. This is our time. Thank you. I hope we will meet again. Please come and join us at SYLVAIN Labs.